how stupid that was. And so, you know, my parents came home and they were laid out on the steps of the top floor with 4 pages of erotica to my friend Valerie. And I came down in the morning and I probably was hungover enough not to realize that it wasn't there. And my parents sat me down and actually my mother said, you better go see Dad in his office, and he worked upstairs, so I went up there. And he said, who is Valerie? And I said, well, she's my girlfriend, Dad, which wasn't quite true. And she said, and you want to, and I saw the letter, and said, you want to send this letter to Valerie? And I said, well, yes, Dad. And he said, you realize you're going to be the laughing stock of the school, don't you? And I said, yes. And you still want to send it? And I said, yes, Dad. He said, right, well, you use the word fuck 4 times. If you only use it once, it would have far more effect. So, I did get advice from time to time, but on the other hand, there was this sort of way in which, as I say, everything became a story. I also, I was driving in a Montreal winter, but not terribly fast, but I was driving the very back-heavy Peugeot around a corner, and I wasn't actually meant to be driving my own just yet. I think I was 2 or 3 days short of getting that permission. And as I came around the corner, the back of the car kind of swung around, and it was one of those great slow-motion moments, and the back left-hand side of the car bounced off a Mercedes that was lined up at the light, and then it spun it, and then the front left-hand side sort of hit a Volvo, and then the front right-hand side hit a third car, make which I can't remember, and then it kind of spun and kind of landed against the bus. And there were no cell phones in those days. I sent my friend who was in the passenger seat to go get my dad and rolled up the windows, and then my dad came down, and there must have been about 20 or 30 people around. They'd ceased sort of hollering at me, and my dad got in the car, and he was only thinking about his insurance and not wanting my insurance to go up. He said, did anybody see you? Which was kind of ludicrous because there were about 40 people there. But of course, an incident like that in which the kid gets into a car accident ended up in one of my dad's books. And so from very early on I was interested in what it means to make things up, essentially, and what it means when we stitch a story together. Again, I can tell you, one more moment. My sister wrote a set of short stories, and they probably could have been described as a bit of fantastical autobiography, and I was having lunch with my parents soon after it was published, and they're very good stories. And I said, maybe Em should have called this a fantastical memoir or something. And my mother, who's very loyal to all her kids, said, no, darling, it's a novel. And in a way she was right, because she had chosen events, arranged them in such a way, and that's what we do when we tell stories. We take we make our own sequences. That's why when you were 8 years old and you punched your brother out or your sister out, your parents would come in, separate you, and listen to one, and then say, okay, what's your story? Or listen to the other version. It was the same incident, but you both have an angle on it. But anyway, after my mom said, no, it's a novel, my dad, who understood novel writing much better, looked at me and winked and said, but don't worry, you come out looking pretty good. So there was that, really. But this idea of making things up, as I say, was really, it has always been and is still very interesting to me. In this book, I was looking at it in a more benign mode, I suppose. And I was thinking, because it was a book that was published just on the crux of an old idea of Canada and a new one coming into sort of a measure of contest, really. And so now the book I'm writing now, or the text I'm writing now, takes this idea of story and applies it much more, with a much more hard political edge. But I'll get to that at the moment. But it was, as I say, it was this idea of how we use stories, to reflect the world back to ourselves, and that's what we all accept. I'm sure those of you who are taking photographs, you have to think early on about the subjectivity of what you do. You have this frame. I can't look at a television screen without thinking about what's outside the frame. I'm always looking in the corners of the picture to see what's there, because it's not enough to zoom in close in on a situation. It's always going to be a false representation to a degree. I can remember that, and I know this because I worked with reporters and I did, produce these sorts of things myself a lot. And I remember when, if we were in, you know, Nigeria or wherever, and I can remember reporters saying to me on a dull day, let's go to the hospital, because then they could go to the hospital and they could take pictures, because most African hospitals are in a sorry state, and they could, I was in radio, not TV, but they could stand and do something in front and sort of use the grief of the situation to present a particular idea. And I remember once, you know, turning aside and saying to the doctor, why are all these families, or why is there such a, in the courtyard of the hospital there must have been 300 people in a space that would normally accommodate about 20. And he said, oh, well, these are the families who come and they take care of the patients. So in other words, that meant that the 300 people in the courtyard were not actually sick, they were just there taking care of the people who were. And I sort of gently said this to the reporter in question, but it was not of interest to him, this information. And so it was a very early lesson in sort of being skeptical about what's presented. And the time that that was not the case was recently with the earthquake in Haiti. If you looked, you know, had those images, if you look in anything, you could see in the corners of the picture in the distance that the situation they were reporting was true. It wasn't just a case of sort of, or truer than it normally is. Maybe what I'll do is, just before I move on to sort of story and stories as battling things, because I think they are, I'm just going to read you a little bit of Newfoundland, if I may. It's just a short passage, but it'll sort of prove what I'm talking about this wonderful subjectivity. Because it's, you know, as I say, having grown up in a family where you had to watch what you said, because you never know what would be made of it, it was great fun for me to travel to Newfoundland. Has anybody been to Newfoundland? Yeah. St. John's is possibly the prettiest city in Canada. It has, there's a fantastic lyric tradition there, and there are a bunch of writers, and they all know each other. So the situations that other writers can avoid by, because they all, you know, Jane Urquhart told one of the writers that I was talking to that she could never do what he did, because he wrote about his family, until her mother was dead. And I completely understand what she means. I often, when people often ask me, are you thinking of writing a novel? I think, well, I say it sometimes, but all the time, no, I'm far too nice, because it does involve a little bit of what Graham Greene, a great English writer, called a sliver of ice in the heart. You have to be a little bit cold and prepared to take the rap for it and hold this idea of whatever truth you're trying to convey more important than whatever offense you might cause. But that's very hard in St. John's, where everybody knows each other, lives just down the road from each other. So what I did there is I gathered, from a couple of radio people in the audience, I gathered a bunch of them, this is always very helpful, in a local bar, and plied them with booze and had them talking with each other, and that gave me a bit of a spine for this chapter. And one of the writers was a woman called Lisa Moore, lovely animated woman. And Lisa and Michael Winter, Michael Crummy, were all close, and they'd all studied under another fella called Larry Matthews. And it was amusing to me that even in writers' families, people could be confused by what was true or not. We tend to sort of, I think now, automatically, because we know so much of the biography of celebrities' lives and so on, or writers' lives, to assume that what they're writing is somehow directly plucked from experience. And it is, but it's kind of jumbled up a bit. So I'll just read, just for fun, 2 pages, if that's all right. Knowing too much about writers and their lives, about who they are and who their friends are, can get in the way of a story that is fiction, after all, if only because the events in it have been edited and selectively arranged. But even doing that takes skill. Do it well enough, and fiction can seem like fact again, with the result that readers and friends sometimes confuse characters with people whom they know. Even writers and their families are not immune to making such mistakes, though it was a surprise to learn that this category of error had been made by the luminaries of Burning Rock, which was a writers' collective. They all helped each other write. At a Larry Matthews class that I'd attended at Memorial, Lisa Moore had been the invited guest. In my first collection of stories, Moore told the table of graduate students, there's a story of a woman who's pregnant. And while she's pregnant, her husband has an affair. Now, Michael Winter is a very good friend of mine, and because he lived here at the time, I'd speak to him every day on the telephone. Often we exchanged pages of what we were writing, sent them back and forth, not by email because he lived just up the street. I'd sent him 4 or 5 pages up and he'd send 4 or 5 pages down to me. So we were in very close contact. But somehow Michael hadn't read this one story of mine and it won an award. I'd moved to Toronto by then and Michael had to phone me and tell me that I'd won the award. Now, I don't know why he was the person that was phoning me, but he sounded completely depressed and I thought, what's wrong? Come on, Michael, I won an award. Finally, he said to me in a grave voice, Lisa, I'm sorry. I didn't know what happened. I didn't know that Steve, her husband, had an affair while you were giving birth. And I was completely stunned because my husband hadn't had an affair, at least not that I knew of. Many of the images in the story of how the childbirth happened were true, she said. Those physical details were so vivid and so dramatic and fresh in my mind that they worked perfectly. But then, when I was writing the story, I thought there needed to be more tension in it. Something bad had to happen. As a writer, what you need to do is to take characters and put them in moral situations that the reader can sympathize with and understand. And then you have to make the worst possible thing happen. So it wasn't enough that this woman nearly died in childbirth. What could be worse, I thought? Could it be worse? And yes, I decided it could have been. Her husband could have been having an affair. And Michael, who actually writes fiction and is completely aware of how a writer takes details that are absolutely true and then changes them, believed the story so much that he was hardly able to speak to me about it. Steve, my husband, was actually the one who answered the phone in Toronto, and he looked baffled and said that Michael had been rude to him and that he hadn't said hello or goodbye or anything. So Steve said to me, what's going on? And then when I told him, Steve said that he'd definitely be having an affair if I ever got pregnant again because so many people were asking him about it and wanted to know if the story was true. And how did you feel about your story after that, a student asked. I think all the fuss indicated that it was very successful for me, said Moore. Less so for Steve. I never thought that for a second, said Michael. Michael, said Lisa, what are you saying? No, said Michael, this was somebody else who said that to you, and you've applied it to me, just like the time when I made you a Bruce Springsteen cassette tape, and there was room to spare at the end of it, so I put on some Otis Redding. About 5 years later, I was in the back of your car with you and Steve, and the cassette was playing, and at the end of it, Otis Redding came on. You turned around and said, isn't this great? I said, yeah, it's good, it's very good. And you said, this is the guy that Springsteen discovered in New Jersey. He had room on the end of his LP, and so he put this unknown guy on the end. Isn't it amazing that he did this? My jaw was dropping, said Michael. I couldn't believe it. I'd made the cassette for you. That's an interesting story, said Michael, but it has nothing to do with what... It just goes to show you how you fabricate, said Michael. How you make interesting stories out of completely bogus details. That was, they were a fun bunch there.